Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. My topic today is Wilhelm Reich and the future of pleasurology. Wilhelm Reich was an Austrian psychoanalyst, meaning he was part of the psychoanalytic school of therapy founded by Sigmund Freud in the early 1900s. And Wilhelm Reich, Wilhelm Reich, Wilhelm Reich was in Vienna after World War I, going to medical school at the University of Vienna, and he joined Freud's psychoanalytic group and became a practicing psychoanalyst, which he did during the 1920s and early 1930s until Hitler came to power. And Reich, being Jewish, a communist, and a psychoanalyst, was on Hitler's shit list for all three counts, being Jewish, being a communist, and being a psychoanalyst. Now, he wasn't a totalitarian communist. He was a democratic, libertarian communist. But in any case, he had to leave Germany. He went to Scandinavia for a few years, and then just before World War II broke out, he was lucky enough to get over to the United States, to New York, and he lived for the rest of his life until 1959 in the New England area. He had a home base in Rangeley, Maine, as well as in New York. Now, the importance of Wilhelm Reich for our purposes here in talking about pleasurology is that Reich's theory of psychotherapy was the theory that I ran across at the very beginning of 1972 as the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s had crested about 1970 and was beginning its slow decline. And people had realized that radical politics was not going to work. We weren't going to have a revolution in the country. So people, well, I myself I was at a loss. I didn't know what to do. I had visited a hippie commune in 1970, but didn't feel at home there, mostly due to my own shyness. And so I didn't know what to do with my life at that point. So I became a drama major in college. It was the easiest thing I could find to do. I just kind of gave up on everything else. I had been studying psychology. I'd been a psychology major for a couple of years, and I had briefly tried history, and I was very interested in the intellectual history of Western civilization from the period of the Enlightenment on up into the 19th century and the present. In other words, the period of history in which intelligent thinkers, began to rebel against Christianity and the Christian worldview, which they rightly considered to be superstitious and old-fashioned and in need of replacing with a rational and realistic worldview, a worldview that today we would call humanist. And I consider myself a humanist who was a member of the psychedelic counterculture, the first wave of the psychedelic counterculture back in the 60s and 70s. And so after it became apparent that social change takes a long time to occur. It doesn't happen just like that. I had taken a class in socialism, the history of socialism, and I was very much taken with the utopian socialists of the early 1800s who wanted to found, and who did found, intentional communities, small villages of people that they hoped would be self-sufficient, and where people could live a life that wasn't as terrible as the life of the average person in the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't a dehumanized life. They were trying to create a society which was a humanistic society where we could get all of our emotional needs met so that we would be happy. Because happiness in life depends on more than just getting our material needs met. We now have a society that meets our material needs if we happen to be in a lucky enough position to, have a decent amount of money. Our material needs are being met better than we could ever expect, better than anybody has ever had them met in the history of humanity. And yet, we're not all that happy. I saw a documentary about Woody Allen, the filmmaker, who's astonishing. He's made so many films. I cannot believe how many films he's made. And, he has become wealthy. He's become famous. He's been married to beautiful women. And yet I saw a documentary where he was riding around in the back of this chauffeur-driven limousine. And he said, I've won all these awards. People think I'm great, I'm famous, and so forth. So why do I still feel cheated? Why do I still feel cheated? And the reason is that he's not emotionally happy. He hasn't had an emotionally fulfilling life. I don't feel cheated in my life. I've had an emotionally fulfilling life. I've been happy, even though I've never been rich, I've never been famous, and I have had only modest achievements in my life. But nevertheless, I've had a wonderful wife, and that's one of the most important sources of happiness in life. But it's important to have our emotional needs fulfilled, and then we can feel that we haven't been cheated in life. And pleasurology is all about learning how to fulfill our emotional needs so that our state of consciousness is a euphoric state of consciousness as much of the time as possible. And that we can count on a daily basis on feeling good, feeling glad to be alive because we feel good. Feeling good is job one. Feeling good is the best revenge for living in a crazy world that doesn't look out for our emotional needs first. We have to practice individual pleasurology because we're not living in a society that's designed for pleasurology. We're not living in a society that's designed to meet our emotional needs. We have to try and get our emotional needs met on a personal basis. That's personal pleasurology. And then once we have learned how to turn ourselves into a person who is capable of experiencing pleasure and experiencing euphoria, and of creating euphoria inside ourselves just by feeling good. Once we've learned how to do that, then we can move from personal pleasurology to interpersonal pleasurology, where we're with another person and we're having a relationship with that person that makes both of us feel happy and feel good, and that we are skillful at having interpersonal relations because we have taken care of the emotional baggage that we've been carrying around with ourselves that make us unhappy. And when people are happy, they treat other people more nicely. And to my mind, we're only going to have peace in the world when the majority of humanity learns how to feel good. Feeling good is job one for peace, because when people feel good, they treat each other in a reasonable way. When people have a lot of repressed anger and tension and fear, they treat other people in a different way. They feel deprived. They feel like I don't have what I want, and I'm not going to get what I want unless I take it from someone else. This is deprivation motivation. And in pleasurology, we want to have a different feeling. We want to have a feeling of sufficiency. My material needs are sufficient. for my personal existence. I don't have to be constantly trying to get more from somebody else. My attitude toward other people doesn't have to be an attitude of getting something from them. It can be an attitude of giving something to them, giving something that when we give it away, we still have just as much of it as we had before. And what that is good vibes. Positive emotional energy, nurturing affection, having an attitude of kindness and respect for other people, and whoever we meet, expecting them to be a good person, to be a friendly person, to be someone we can respect, someone who will treat us as well as we treat them. If we approach other people with that expectation, the chances are much greater that that is how they will respond to us. But some people, having been brought up in a world of emotional deprivation as well as physical deprivation, with harsh people around them who've never gotten the nurturing affection that they need, they may be suspicious of everyone around them, and they treat everyone as a potential enemy. And by doing that, they alienate the people around them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you treat people with fear and suspicion and anger, they're going to give that kind of vibe back to you. They're going to consider you somebody they want to, stay away from. Whereas, if we look at the world realistically, look at the world right around us, and we say, okay, let's all get along here. We can get along fine. Let's be reasonable and friendly with each other. First, we have to have that kind of a trusting personality. Not that we trust everybody we meet, because there are so many people out there who are operating on deprivation motivation, and they're not trustworthy. And so we approach them with the default attitude of, yes, I will start out by trusting you and assuming that you're just a good-hearted person like me. If we're both good-hearted persons, then we're going to get along all right, and we'll work out any differences we might have. But even though that's the attitude we start out with someone, assuming they're going to be a good-hearted person that we can respect and be friendly with, and that they will treat us nicely if we treat them nicely, if it turns out that that's not the case, if we realistically perceive that this person's character, this person's emotional character, is one of suspicion and fear and antagonism and competitiveness, then we have to protect ourselves from them. Then we have to defend ourselves from them. But we don't start out being defended, being on guard against everyone we meet in life. This was the hippie attitude of the first wave psychedelic culture in the 60s and 70s, was we'd grown up in the Cold War world where our attitude was we're surrounded by enemies. And then we turned on to the psychedelics, and they made us realize, we don't have to have that attitude. And we can assume that people are actually good, that most people are actually good, they're good-hearted, and they just want what we all want, which is to be appreciated and to be treated kindly and with respect. And so hippies tried to do that. And the authoritarian people like the police in San Francisco, who were very much in favor of the, defended attitude, they hated the hippies for doing that and would beat them up just for trying to be nice. There was a lot of resistance to this new attitude of let's trust each other, let's get along. Come on, people, let's get together. Let's try to love one another. There was a lot of resistance to that because our society, traditionally, historically, our society has given us a combination of capitalism and Christianity, both of which, if a child is raised within that environment and that thought view, both Christianity and capitalism can make people defensive, frightened, suspicious, and angry people. Christianity, because it makes people feel guilty about their sex drive and satisfying their sex drive. And Christianity makes people feel guilty for being imperfect in any way. And Christianity says, oh, you're a sinner who's destined to go to hell, unless you believe in Christian fantasies. So Christianity scares us with hell and makes us feel ashamed of our sexuality. And capitalism says, you're going to starve unless you get a job and work hard for whoever will give you a job. And if not, you get tossed out on your ear. So you've got to fight somebody else to get a job. Other people are your competitors in capitalism. You have to fight to get ahead. Capitalism is just like warfare translated into economic terms. And so both Christianity and capitalism tend to create a defensive emotional character in people. And the psychedelics came along, and for a little while, the psychedelics could dissolve that suspicion, that fear, that anxiety, that anger that we look at life with, and allow us instead to feel calm and feel like, I have everything I need right now. I don't need to be getting something from somebody else. And other people are beautiful. Human beings are beautiful. It's wonderful to share affection with human beings and to be nice to other human beings. And we should recognize that inside of each other person, every other person that we're with, is a consciousness just like ours, a consciousness and a heart that wants nurturing affection. Every person we meet, deep down inside, wants to love and be loved. And we could be bringing out that side of human nature if we had a society that said, yeah, that's the most important thing that we need to teach our children, is how to love each other in a kind and affectionate way, a respectful way, and not be afraid to be kind and loving and nurturing to each other. And that was the hippie vision. Now, in 1971-72, in the winter of 71-72, I came across the works of Wilhelm Reich. I didn't know anything about him, but I had heard his name in counterculture circles, and so I was interested in him. I had taken classes in personality theory and in psychotherapy and all that covered like every branch of psychotherapy and every branch of personality theory, and nowhere was there a mention of Wilhelm Reich. He was like blackballed. He was blacklisted, by mainstream psychology. And so, being a good counterculture person, I said, well, that's the kind of person that I should be trying to find out about. If he's been excluded by straight society, there must be a reason for it. He must have something good to say that straight society doesn't want to hear. So I want to look into this guy. And so I did. And I learned what Reich theorized about human personality, and it was a totally different way of looking at people than anything I had experienced in any of my personality theory classes or my counseling classes. And what I want to say is that Reich was working very early on in psychology. He was only the second generation of practicing psychologists. If Freud was the first generation, Reich was coming along the second generation. Same generation as Carl Jung, whom everybody has heard about, because Jung was all into symbolism and mysticism and quasi-religious stuff. And so for a Christian society, that's not too big a stretch. But what was Reich into that made him so controversial in the eyes of mainstream society? Why was he never accepted by psychologists? Sex and catharsis. were the two things that Reich was in favor of. He was a little too radical for his time. He believed that sexual satisfaction was a good thing, particularly orgasms were a good thing, because sex is one of our most important biological drives. It's built into our brain. It's built into our emotional brain. We all have a sex drive. And just like we have to satisfy our food drive in order to be happy, we need to satisfy our sex drive in order to be happy. If we don't satisfy our food drive, we're going to be hungry all the time. And if we don't satisfy our sex drive, we're going to either be horny all the time and feel dissatisfied, or we're going to suppress our sex drive completely and lose out on one of the most important and most enjoyable types of pleasure in life. So Reich felt that it was important to not suppress our sex drive, but to satisfy it with the best orgasms we possibly could. That was one thing that made him objectionable to mainstream psychologists who just weren't prepared to go so far as to recommend to their therapist, yeah, you need to satisfy your sex drive with good orgasms every so often. People didn't want to talk about masturbation as a way of satisfying your sex drive. Therapists didn't want to say, yeah, you need to go home and masturbate and take care of your sex drive. That's the simplest thing to do. Or you need to find a sexual partner and have sex with them and have good orgasms in partner sex. Therapists didn't want to go there. And therapists also didn't want to go to the other place that Reich recommended, which was actively encouraging patients to express their emotions as unreservedly as possible. This is what's called catharsis. That's why I said sex and catharsis were the two things that Reich recommended, which were controversial in the eyes of psychologists and which psychologists were afraid to touch. They were afraid to touch the issue of sexual satisfaction, and they were afraid to try and to get into this issue of emotional expression, catharsis of emotions. Now, Freud, right back at the beginning of psychoanalysis, had said that it was catharsis which brought about the improvement in his neurotic patients. I mean, he only had like one or two patients, a handful of patients at the most, who actually got better. And he based his whole theory on those patients. And catharsis was part of the healing process. He felt that neurosis, which is a state of ongoing nervous tension, neurosis was caused, in Freud's mind, by repressing certain ideas, certain wishes, particularly sexual wishes. And to repress those wishes means to push them out of mind every time they occurred. For instance, the classic one is the Oedipal wish or the Electra wish, where a person is attracted either to their parents or could be also to another family member or an uncle or a godfather or somebody who was socially not an acceptable person to have sexual feelings about. In society, you're not supposed to have sexual feelings about anybody in your family. And so if people had those feelings, sexual attraction to a family member, they knew that society disapproved of that. That society would think, if society knew that they were having those feelings of sexual attraction for a family member, that society would think there was something wrong with them, morally wrong with them. They were a bad person morally, or they were somehow sick emotionally. Not recognizing that our emotional brain is going to be attracted naturally to whoever we happen to be on the most intimate terms with in our daily life. The people that we have the chance to interact with most intimately are the ones that our emotional brain is naturally going to get attracted to and have feelings for. So, but in late Victorian society, around 1900, 1910, people didn't think that way at all. They were horrified. And so when a person would have a feeling like that, it would create a lot of anxiety in them because they knew it was so socially forbidden. It would create anxiety and guilt, and those are emotional tension. And their emotional brain, as a result, would start broadcasting anxiety energy out into their entire body, making them very tense, making their muscles tense up, making their autonomic nervous system that controls heart rate and blood pressure and the level of blood sugar, adrenaline, their hormone system, all these things the emotional brain controls, and it would create a state of chronic tension in the person. And it could be all kinds of things. It could be backaches and headaches. It could be panic attacks. It could be fainting spells. It could be paralysis of a limb. All of these things were stress symptoms created by the emotional brain. Freud didn't know that because nobody had ever heard of the emotional brain. In Freud's time, they knew nothing about how the brain worked, really, very, very little. And so Freud had this idea that when a forbidden idea, like attraction to a family member, comes into consciousness and creates this anxiety, and we don't like the feeling of anxiety, we don't like the feeling of being guilty for having that thought, for being ashamed of ourselves for having that thought. So we try and push that thought out of consciousness and run away from it into some other kind of thoughts, so that we're running away from part of ourself. We're running away from part of our own true emotions. And those emotions are pushed back out of consciousness, and they're still there. Those feelings are still there. But Freud said, well, but they're now unconscious. We don't allow them into consciousness. But the very process of pushing them out of consciousness and keeping them out of consciousness and running away from them into some other kind of thinking about something else that's not forbidden, that very process creates ongoing tension in the whole system, and that is what is creating the neurotic symptoms, the symptoms of neurosis, 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 which is basically what people came to Freud to try and get rid of. Oh, I have these headaches, I can't sleep at night, or I have terrible dreams, or, I'm having problems with my irritable bowel syndrome, all kinds of things that can be stress related. And they would come to Freud, and he found that if he had them lie down, and sometimes he would hypnotize them, but other times he would just have them lie down and just start saying whatever came into their mind. And don't censor whatever comes into your mind, he would say. Whatever comes into your mind, you have to say it to me, tell it to me. And before long, if he was lucky, that forbidden wish would come up, and the person would admit it. And talk about it. And if they did talk about it with Freud, and if Freud gave them unconditional acceptance rather than judging them negatively, when they said this thing was socially forbidden, if he just said, okay, all right, that's natural, tell me more about it, talk about it, and express it. And it was such a relief to the person to be able to talk about this forbidden sexual wish openly with someone who wasn't going to judge them for it, wasn't going to think they were sick and bad for having that feeling, but who would just let them talk about it. That relieved so much stress from their emotional brain that they were able to relax, and their symptoms went away. Those stress symptoms went away because their emotional brain was so relieved at finally having gotten this secret thought and wish out into the open to someone who would accept it without being judgmental, and would say, oh no, that's fine. You're fine. You're not crazy. That's a natural kind of feeling to have. Freud said, it's universal for children to have sexual attractions to their parents. Which is not everybody does, but probably all of us have some kind of sexual attractions that we don't want other people to know about, because then they would judge us as being in some way sexually sick, emotionally sick, morally sick, rather than recognizing what Freud finally came to recognize was, well, human sexuality just isn't that neat and simple. Human sexuality is polymorphous. It comes in many, many shapes and directions, and we can learn to be attracted to just about anybody, and we can learn to do all kinds of different things that feel sexy to us that are not simply penis-vagina sex, which was the only kind of sex which in Freud's day was not considered perverted sex. Any other sex than penis-vagina sex was considered to be a diversion of the sexual drive energy into some other activity that wasn't what nature intended. Nature intended, according to these people, for sex to be just for procreation and for intercourse. But Freud said, no, that's crazy. Human sexuality is extremely diverse, and we need to accept its diversity. This is a point that was made in a book called Life Against Death by Norman O. Brown, he was, I think, a philosopher, but he studied Freud, and he ended up at UC Santa Cruz. But he wrote a book saying, well, according to Freud's theory, we should all recognize that we're polymorphously perverse. Our sexuality is polymorphously perverse, and it is normal for human sexuality to take many, many shapes and to not be focused on just penis-vagina intercourse, that there are many other types of sexual pleasure that human beings enjoy, and we shouldn't consider ourselves sexually unhealthy if we do enjoy those. We should accept the fact that the human sex drive is just as variable as everything else that human beings do. All of our other behavior, we do so many more different kinds of things than any other species does. Every other species, their behavior is fairly narrow. Human beings, we do all kinds of stuff. And we dress in so many different kinds of ways. Other species don't even get dressed. But we have all kinds of dress, we have all kinds of foods, we have all kinds of things we make, we have all kinds of sports that we do, we have all kinds of arts that we perform, we have all kinds of skills and tasks that we know. Humanity is the most diverse species on the planet. So why should we say that our sexuality has to be narrowly constrained to penis-vagina sex, and that's the only thing that counts? On the contrary, what counts, if we now go to Wilhelm Reich's theory, Wilhelm Reich said, all right, good. Let's be aware of whatever repressed ideas, whatever repressed sexual ideas we have, let them into consciousness. And as Freud said, look at them in consciousness, right in the center of consciousness. Look at whatever sexual wishes we actually have without judging them. And then most of them, if they're somehow sexually inappropriate, socially inappropriate, we're not actually going to act on them. But there's no reason we can't enjoy them in fantasy, whatever they happen to be. We can fantasize about these wishes. And what Wilhelm Reich said is, the important thing ultimately is to satisfy our sex drive and discharge all of our sexual drive energy by orgasm, because orgasm is to the sex drive what eating food is to the hunger drive. When we're hungry, then we eat food, our hunger drive is satisfied and goes away. And for a while, we don't need to eat any more food. when we feel sexually aroused, we have an orgasm, and our sex drive should be satisfied after the orgasm, and then we don't feel the need for sexual activity for a while again. But before that, our sex drive gives us an urge for sexual activity and a desire for the pleasure of sexual activity, and especially for the pleasure of orgasm. And if we satisfy that desire with a sufficiently powerful orgasm, then our sex drive is satisfied, and we can go on to do whatever else we want to do in life. Read a book, go outside, be with friends, engage in artwork, whatever we want to do. Once we've satisfied our sex drive, then our energy is freed up to do those other things. So Wilhelm Reich believed that having good orgasms was an essential part of psychotherapy. What's the goal of psychotherapy? To help people live happily, to enjoy their lives. People come to therapy because I'm not happy, nothing's working in my life, I don't feel good, And so an essential part of feeling good, which is what psychotherapy is about, is having orgasms which are powerful enough to satisfy our sex drive. And so Wilhelm Reich found that a lot of his patients were having orgasms, but they still, weren't that satisfied, and they were still nervous and tense, and their neurotic symptoms hadn't gone away. And so Reich developed this theory, and this is the theory that I learned at the beginning of 1972, just before I started doing pleasurology. I learned about Reich's theory at the beginning of 72, and I learned my first pleasurology exercises at the Pinecrest Drama Workshop the following summer, a few months later. And from then, I went on to seek out and accumulate other pleasurology techniques that I hadn't learned at the summer workshop. But they gave me an idea of where to look, particularly in the Asian traditions of pleasurology, meditation and yoga and all that stuff that ordinarily people think of as being religious. But in fact, they are just ways of feeling really, really good and creating really euphoric states of consciousness. So I do a lot of these Asian techniques without any religious or spiritual ideas having to do with them at all, but just to make myself feel good physically and emotionally, and to create euphoric states of consciousness, as well as super euphoric sex. Okay, now, so that's where pleasurology was going to go, and for me. And before I got into it, I had learned Reich's theory. And here was the key part of Reich's theory. He theorized that his patients were not able to have fully satisfying orgasms. They had orgasms, but they weren't fully satisfying. They didn't leave the person feeling satisfied. And he felt the reason was that they had all this tension in their body, in the muscles of their body. He called this muscle armor, body armor. And it was chronic tension in the muscles that was accompanied by what he called character armor or emotional armor. That every patient had a certain emotional attitude toward the world. And they might have been, had a suspicious attitude or a frightened attitude or an angry attitude, or just a very impassive attitude, a very withdrawn attitude. There were all kinds of different attitudes, or depressed attitude, and that the emotional attitude which they had, the character armor, was part of the same process that was in the body expressed as muscle tensions. the same process expressed itself in the body as muscle tensions and also autonomic nervous system disturbances in the internal organs. But anyway, body disturbances, the same process produced the emotional attitude that he could see on a person's facial expression and that he could hear in their voice, in the tone of their voice and their whole attitude. So he realized both of those were being caused by the same process. And the only process he could think of that would be causing it was the repression of natural emotional impulses. That there were emotional impulses coming out of us that we were not expressing because society had taught us not to. Society had punished us or shamed us for expressing these emotions, and we were taught to suppress them. If we were sad, we were taught to not cry. If we were angry, we were taught to hold it inside, or somebody would punish us. And if we were frightened, we were taught to just be calm and don't let yourself be frightened. In other words, there was a prohibition against feeling our real emotions. And Reich said, it's the effort of keeping those emotions suppressed and not expressed, which is creating the tension in the muscles in our body, the tension in our breathing. He recognized that people's breathing was not fluid and relaxed. It was stiff, it was shallow, it was tight, it was constrained. And this attitude, the constant emotional character attitude that a person faced the world with. And there are three basic attitudes we can have to the world. We can be going towards something that we desire, and we're not afraid of it. We want to get it. We're going toward it. But we could find the world frightening, and we would be trying to get away from something, from a threat in the world. Or if there's a threat and we feel we want to destroy it, we go against it with anger. So we can be full of desire, we can be full of fear, we can be full of anger, and we can be full of sadness and just giving up. This is depression. It's like, the world is too much for me, I can't handle it. And so we get caught in these emotional attitudes. And so what Reich felt would be the cure for it was to go back to what Freud said about catharsis. Catharsis, the emotional purification of our system by expressing these emotions, letting them out completely. For instance, I think, once Freud's patients were able to tell him about their unexpressed forbidden wishes, the relief of that, they might just then start crying because it was such a relief to finally tell someone about it, and it felt so good to get it out and let it go. And that kind of catharsis was really a relief to their nervous system, and they could calm down and their neurotic symptoms would go away for a while after they had that catharsis. So Reich wanted to work on the body armor by prodding the body. He felt he could force people to express these emotions that they were holding in. He had diagnosed the problem as the non-expression of emotions that were there that needed to be gotten out. And so he was looking for a solution to try and help people get those feelings out. And so he didn't know what he was doing. He had never worked with the body before in that way. He didn't know anybody. There were no psychotherapists who had started working with the body. They were all just working with the mind and talking. So Reich came up with a kind of therapy. Now, therapy is what we do to get better, actual practical things that we do to get better. So pleasurology is a therapy. It's a whole assembly of different therapeutic practices that we do in order to make ourselves more euphoric, to get the tensions out of our emotional brain, to get the tensions out of our body. And that was what I learned how to do there, starting with the Pinecrest Drama Workshop. But before I went to the workshop, I was reading a couple books about Reich. There was another book called Me and the Orgone by a guy named Orson Bean, who was an actor. And he described Reich's theory in a nutshell, in a popular way, in a very simple way to understand. And he described Reichian therapy that he himself had gone through back in New York with one. Wilhelm Reich was dead by the time that Orson Bean did this, but so Orson Bean got the therapy from one of Wilhelm Reich's students, who was by then, who was a doctor and was now the official Reichian therapist. And it was a painful therapy because the therapist would dig in with his fingers into the tight muscles, trying to force the person to relax the muscles by pressing them so hard that they hurt. And then the fact that a person would hurt so much, they would eventually have to scream and yell and to express that pain. And so this Reichian therapy was a way of trying to force people into catharsis, into getting the emotional energy out by painfully pressing their tight muscles, hoping that pain, making those muscles feel more pain, would help them relax. Okay, so the concept that Wilhelm Reich didn't have was relaxation. I wanted to go to New York. When I read about this therapy, I thought, I was so naive. I thought, oh man, if I could just go to New York and have Reichian therapy, I would be cured and everything would be good. But I can't afford to do that. There's no way I'm going to be able to do that. So I'll just have to, be satisfied with myself the way I am, and there's nothing I can do about it. So I resigned myself to not having, really good orgasms. I have pretty good orgasms, and in fact, I started having much better orgasms just from the fact of reading Wilhelm Reich and learning from him that sex is a natural biological drive and that it's healthy for us emotionally to satisfy that drive. It's healthy for us physically to satisfy that drive, and so we should do that. So that was great because that made my masturbation free of guilt from that point on. I'd had Christian masturbation guilt taught to me by my preacher father when I was 12 years old. And I'd been laboring under that for many years. And then gradually I learned intellectually, to not feel so bad about masturbation. But it wasn't until I read Reich, and he was the first really sex-positive person that I read. It wasn't until then that I was really able to masturbate wholeheartedly and enthusiastically, and without any feeling of guilt or surreptitiousness. I would wait till my roommate once a week would go across town to visit his parents, and I knew I would have the apartment to myself for the whole evening because he was eating dinner with them and he wouldn't get back till later. So I had the whole apartment to myself, and our cat, Vanessa, who would sit up on the dresser next to the bed, watch me where I was lying out on the bed with my massage oil and my Penthouse magazine, and I'd gotten high on cannabis and was really enjoying myself masturbating, and I got used to letting Vanessa watch me. So it was the first time I'd ever let anybody watch me masturbate, and that was a very liberating experience, because I wasn't forcing Vanessa to watch. She just found it quite interesting to observe. So she just sat there, and she wasn't making any judgments. She never tried to make me feel ashamed or guilty about it. She just accepted it, saying, "Oh, that's cool. Wonder what Steve's doing that for." And anyway, what happened was, with pleasurology, I was able to perform Reichian therapy on myself better than Wilhelm Reich ever could have done it on me, or even Dr. Baker, his assistant, Ellsworth Baker in New York. I ended up blundering into a form of therapy that solved Wilhelm Reich's conundrum. His question, his puzzle was, how do we get rid of this character armor and this emotional armor? How do we get rid of it? And I found a way to do that much more effectively than Reich ever did, because Reich, was lacking a whole bunch of stuff that I will tell you about next time. I will tell you exactly how I stumbled into these different exercises and different combinations of things, because that's the deal about this comprehensive pleasurology that I want to be teaching you, is that I think all of the main components have to be combined. We have to do all the different kinds of practices, muscle relaxing practices, getting high on cannabis, which facilitates, if you relax your muscles and practice that for a few weeks, and then you get high on cannabis, it facilitates memories from the past, emotionally upsetting memories from the past, coming into consciousness. And it allows us to feel the emotions associated with those upsetting events and to then express them. If we know that expressing those emotions is the thing to do instead of running away from them or suppressing them, if we know that letting them out is the thing to do, cannabis makes it very easy to do that after we've done the muscles to relax the body armor in our body, which has been serving the function of keeping those emotions inside. We've tightened up the muscles in order to prevent ourselves from expressing the emotions. But if we've done a few weeks of these muscle loosening exercises, then when those emotionally charged memories come into consciousness, we can let ourselves feel all the emotional feelings that are associated with those memories and do whatever whatever we want to do, whatever our emotional brain wants us to do. If we want to cry, if we want to get angry and yell, we need to find therapeutic ways to get angry and let our anger out without hurting anybody else or scaring anybody else. And then, all right, so cannabis can help us with the catharsis, particularly if we've loosened up our muscles. And then once we've had the catharsis, and it feels so good to get that emotional energy out, and it's such a relief afterwards, then we can go on. We don't want to just leave it at that, because if we do, we're just going to get tense again. We need to then calm down emotionally, learn how to practice emotional calming exercises. And we need to learn how to stabilize our consciousness, stabilize our attention, so that our whole consciousness becomes nice and still. And this is where we can get into the Asian traditions of mind clearing our mind of the thoughts that ordinarily clutter our mind, and calming ourselves emotionally, relaxing our face completely, doing a Buddhist type of meditation, because our body feels good now. We've gotten rid of those emotions that wanted to come out. It's been good to release them. Now we can relax, and we can learn to achieve a state of coherent consciousness, where we're aware of our whole field of consciousness, we're aware of our entire body. Our emotional brain is calm, and our mind is relatively free of thoughts, and we're focusing our attention just where we want it to be. I like to listen to music and focus my attention on the music. Focusing attention on the breathing is really good. And we can achieve a state of cannabis samadhi. That is, and there's a really blissful state where our consciousness is simply undisturbed. We're high on cannabis, our body feels good, our emotions feel good, and we can have a really coherent, orderly, well-ordered field of consciousness. It feels just wonderful to just be in that state. And once we've learned to do that, then we can take these skills into our sexual activity and learn how to become sexually aroused gradually and slowly. Let our consciousness absorb the sexual energy that's being generated. Let our consciousness be focused on exactly whatever fantasy or stimulus is turning us on the most, so that we're generating lots of emotional energy to accompany the physical pleasure of masturbation or any other form of sexual activity. The physical pleasure and the emotional pleasure mix together in consciousness in a form of sexual alchemy or sexual chemistry, where we're mixing physical pleasure and emotional pleasure. The more emotional pleasure we can generate from being turned on, the more emotionally turned on we are sexually, the more sexually pleasurable the physical sensations from our body, from our sex organs and the rest of our body, become intensely more pleasurable. And so we generate this intense cloud of sexual bliss, euphoria that fills our consciousness. And we have learned how to relax our consciousness so that we can let that cloud expand. And then we can pause before we have an orgasm. We can pause when we realize we're getting close to triggering the orgasm reflex, and let that bliss cloud subside. And then begin sexual activity and begin fantasizing again, and raise our level of sexual bliss up again with a new surge of sexual turn-on energy, because it's the surge of emotional turn-on, the emotional arousal energy, that makes the physical pleasure all of a sudden release this bliss cloud in consciousness. The physical pleasure can be going on just the same without any difference in the physical stimulation. But when our emotional brain gets stimulated by a particularly arousing fantasy or arousing thought or arousing stimulus of some sort, when we get emotionally aroused, that's when that physical energy that isn't any different than it was a moment ago, all of a sudden becomes much more pleasurable and fills our consciousness with bliss energy. And eventually, if we do this without triggering an orgasm several times, or as many times as we want, we can go on for hours doing that. And then finally, at some point, when our consciousness is completely filled with bliss energy, we can continue the stimulation, continue thinking about the fantasy, and we will trigger the orgasm reflex, and that will be a thunderous orgasm, an orgasm that just thunders through our entire consciousness. And each orgasmic wave from the orgasm muscles as they contract down around the sex organs, each of those waves, each wave of pleasure fills our entire consciousness with a thunderous wave of sexual bliss energy. And that's the Cosmic Oceanic Orgasm. And once you've had one of those, which is, a succession of those waves of bliss, and your body is then just completely moving without any resistance, because our body is now relaxed, and so our emotional brain is creating the movements of our body without any voluntary intention to move, and we're not preventing ourselves from moving. We're just allowing the emotional brain to take over our body and just kind of move it however we want, just like in a sneeze. When you sneeze, all you have to do is surrender to the sneeze. You don't want to resist the sneeze. You don't want to try and hold the sneeze in, because when the sneeze comes and you try and hold it in, you just get this conflict within the body. It's very painful. So you let the sneeze out. Well, same thing with the orgasm. When the orgasm is ready to blow itself out of you, just relax and let it go. And then afterwards, then we know what we mean by having the sex drive completely and utterly satisfied, with no residual sexual urgency whatsoever. And that's a fantastic experience. So my hypothesis is, this is my scientific guess, this is my prediction. My scientific prediction is that when a significant number of people actually start practicing this comprehensive pleasurology program, that a high percentage of them will be able to have cosmic orgasms like that. And an even higher percentage of them will just in general feel much better in their life emotionally in their daily life. And they will end up not having to say what Woody Allen said, not having to say, I feel I've been cheated, but instead saying, no, I feel I've had an emotionally rich life and a pleasurable life. And I'm satisfied with that. So I'll be telling you more about that next time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.